I recently was talking to someone who had a family member that, excuse me for the summer cold, aren't they glorious? I was talking to a family member. They had somebody in their family that they were one of those guys that just, whatever they went to do, they were a success in business, and they got started in so many different areas. You kind of go, how in the world do they even think to start a business in this area? And I just asked him, I said, I'm not trying to be nosy or anything, but how does he do this? Is it just luck or what? And without thinking for a second, his answer was quick and simple. He's not afraid. He said, that's the key. He's not afraid. He's not afraid to try this business, to stick his neck out there, to go out, to take risk and all. And even though he's had some failures, the successes have far outweighed the failures. He's not afraid. When I think of that and that type of person, I think of Simon Peter, a man who walked with Jesus literally daily for about 3.5 years. And as you look at Simon Peter's life, he was not afraid. He was not afraid to get out of the boat and walk on the water. He was not afraid to be the one who would profess that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. He was not afraid to, on the night that Jesus was arrested, to pull a sword and basically say, I'll take on the whole Roman army that's here to arrest him. And he wasn't afraid on the day of Pentecost to stand up and preach in front of thousands of people what we know as the first gospel sermon. He wasn't afraid. But he had a major flaw. Simon Peter, in the midst of being so bold and courageous, he had one major flaw that led to the greatest failure of his life, the greatest embarrassment. And that was when he betrayed Jesus on the night that he was arrested. And here it is. Here's the thing. It was confidence. Now, some of you want to say that I could say he was confident. You might say he was overconfident. And on one side, I say his problem was his confidence. But on the other side, I believe you have to have confidence to live the Christian life. I believe you have to have confidence to walk the Christian life. So what was wrong with Peter's confidence? And this is it, if you hadn't already figured it out. Peter's confidence was in himself and not in God. It wasn't in Jesus. And as you read through and you study Simon Peter's life, you see this crop up so many different times where his confidence was. It was in him. You know, when there's a plane crash, you know, when we hear it on the news and we read about it, and the first thing that happens is we're heartbroken, and our heart goes out to the families and the destruction and the death and everything you see, and it just kind of breaks your heart. But immediately, attention turns to something else, and that's finding the black box. The FAA, they go after that. They start looking for the evidence. What caused this plane crash? And then a hunt goes like no other to find the black box. They call it the black box, but it's really an orange box, so it's easier to be seen. But in that orange box, the flight data recorder, they're able to go back and see what happened leading up to the crash, because they want to find out what caused this, so if it's something that can be avoided, it won't ever happen again. Well, this morning, we can take the time to look, I believe, is in the black box of what led up to Simon Peter's great crash. And that's what I want to do this morning, is just look at the evidence, the warning signs that we saw in his life that led to the biggest crash in his life. Now, about 99% of the time, we're going to be in Matthew chapter 26. If you want to go ahead and turn there, that's where we're going to be. It's going to be on the screen as well. But in Matthew 26, we're going to find these things. The first one is this, that Peter had an attitude of, you can count on me. You can count on me. It was Ronald Reagan who said this famous quote, the most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. That's always been one of my favorite. But you understand that Simon Peter kind of had that same attitude. Hey, everybody relax, I'm here. I'm here, I can take care of things. We've got this thing covered here. I'm here to save the day. And he even exhibited that with Jesus. Matthew 26, verses 31 through 35 says it this way. Now, this is right after the Passover meal, and they're all together on that final night. Starting with verse 31, it says this, "Then Jesus told them, 'This very night you will all fall away on account of me. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee.'" Verse 33, "Peter replied, 'Even if all fall away on account of you, I never will.' 'I tell you the truth,' Jesus answered, 'this very night, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. But Peter declared, 'Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you.' And all the other disciples said the same." Peter had great zeal. He had great passion, great strength, great courage, and boldness. Jesus desired to use those characteristics, those gifts that he had in his very makeup, his personality. He wanted to use those things to advance the kingdom of God. He wanted to work through Peter. But first he had to work in Simon Peter. Because Simon Peter had not yet learned how to use those great characteristics of his in a great way. Peter operated on the premise that Jesus needed his help, that he couldn't do it without him. You know, what Jesus wanted was the same thing he wants for us. The same thing. He will use our talents. He will use our abilities and our boldness and our courage and our gentleness and our kindness. But he must first have us surrender to him. He wants to use those things and work for us, through us, but we first must surrender to him. I am a big John Wayne fan. I always remember the story. It was a few years ago, Greg Webb came to my office, and we were talking about Westerns and John Wayne and stuff, and he said, Greg Webb says, "I don't think I've ever seen a Western." I said, "Get out of my office." I said, "I can't even talk to you." But John Wayne is one of my favorite people, one of my favorite actors, and the things I've read about his life, and I loved his attitude about life. But for Christianity, for walking with Jesus Christ, we don't need a John Wayne attitude. Stand strong, be bold, ride in the saddle and take on all the bad guys ourselves. It isn't the John Wayne attitude we need. We need another John attitude, and that's John the Baptist. We remember it was John who said, "I must decrease and he must increase." That's the attitude. It's a surrendering of your very soul to him and your abilities. Look at this attitude that is revealed in Peter. He says, "I will never fall away. Even if everybody else does, I will not." He's saying, look around you, Jesus. I can't speak for these other guys that's in the group, but I will never do these things. You know, this goes right along with what the conversation that was going on just a little time before that. They were in the upper room, and they were talking around the meal. You remember a couple of things happened. One, they began to talk about who was the greatest. Who was the greatest among them? So and you know Simon Peter was right in the middle of that conversation, that who's the most important of them. And then it gets into the part where Jesus says, one of you is going to betray me. And they begin to say, well, Lord, it isn't me, is it? You know, and that wasn't, I don't believe, from a humble attitude of, Lord, could it possibly be me? I think it was more of, well, it's not going to be me that it's going to happen from. So this would go right along with it, that an attitude of that possibly can happen. I'm too big, I'm too important. In 1950, the Gallup organization asked high school seniors this question: are you a very important person? 1950, high school seniors. At that point, only 12% said yes. They asked that same question in 2005. Are you a very important person? 80% of the seniors said, yes, I am a very important person. Now, you can take that several different ways. But Peter exhibited a tremendous amount of faith. But the faith wasn't necessarily in Jesus. It was in himself. You see, I'm not questioning Peter's love for Jesus. I'm not questioning his faith in Jesus. I'm not questioning his willingness to die, because he was willing to die. He just had a hard time surrendering to Jesus. And listen to this, real close. Confidence in yourself makes it extremely hard to surrender to Jesus Christ. As long as you think you've got it all under control, it's extremely difficult to surrender to Jesus. When Peter denied Jesus that third time and the rooster crowed, the only person who was surprised was Simon Peter. Jesus had already known it was going to happen. So when we look at that flight data recorder, the first evidence we see is Peter's confidence in himself was a big mistake. And the second one is this: too busy to pray. Just too busy to pray. And just like that flight recorder uncovers hidden mistakes, we see this as a big one in Simon Peter's life. Someone once said, "You will only pray as much as you see your need to pray." Let me say that again. You will only pray as much as you see your need to pray. And apparently Peter didn't see the dangers that lie ahead in the next hours. And Jesus tried to impress it upon him and the others, but it just didn't work. Over in one of the companion or parallel accounts of this story, Luke 22:31 says it this way. Jesus said this to Simon. He says, "Simon, Simon, Satan is asked to sift you as wheat." He's trying to tell him, he says, "Simon, you're about ready to be put through the ringer. You're going to get the worst that the devil can throw at you, because he's coming after me. And you're going to be caught up right into that storm. It's coming for you. And you need to be ready. Satan is asked to sift you like wheat." But we see what Jesus did. It says that Jesus then went and prayed. It said he prayed so intensely that the sweat fell from his body like drops of blood. What did Peter do? Well, he slept. Look at Matthew 26:40 and 41. Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. "Could you men not keep watch with me for 1 hour?" he asked Peter. "Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the body is weak." I get that. I get that. I understand that. How many of you have fallen asleep while you were praying? Now, tell the truth. Let the Lord love you. Raise your hand if you have fallen asleep. I'm not talking about you finished your prayers and you slipped off into peaceful spiritual sleep. I'm talking about you fell asleep while you were praying. Okay, all right. Okay, good. I get it, Peter. I get it. You're tired. It has been a long day. It's been a long week for these guys. But do you fall asleep during the most important moments of your life? No, we don't. We don't fall asleep during the most important moments of our life. No amount of fatigue or no amount of excuses can take what he did here away. It was wrong. Now, as review, the Passover supper has happened. Jesus takes them out, and they want to go to a place, a private place. And so he takes them to the Olive Garden, not the restaurant, a real olive garden, a place where they grew olives. It was called the Mount of Olives, and he took them there. And it was a place to be alone. And he leaves the disciples. He says, "Stay here and pray." But he takes Peter, James, and John and goes a little bit further, tells them to do the same thing. Then he goes on off and prays by himself. He comes back. 3 times it says he comes back and finds them asleep. We just read that. They were asleep within minutes of the biggest night of their life. Philip Pettit was a famous high-wire artist. His greatest accomplishment was walking between the World Trade Centers in 1974. In the 2015 movie, The Walk, the story of his life, one scene depicts a true learning experience in his life. Philip Even before he's become a performer, he's just trying to learn it. He was with a traveling group in France, and when there was no people in the tent, he would go up and practice on the high wire. And one time he was in the tent by himself, and he walked across the whole length of the tent on that thin high wire. And down below, his mentor came in. His name was Papa Rudy. And he watched him, and when he got within 3 feet of the platform on the other side, he stopped. But then he tried to take that final step, and all of a sudden this wire began to go back and forth. He dropped the pole, and he fell, but he grabbed the wire and held on, and then finally pulled himself back up on the platform. And then when he came down the ladder, and he was met by Papa Rudy at the bottom, and this is what he said. He said, most walkers, they die when they arrive. They think they have arrived, but they're still on the wire. If you have 3 steps to do, and you take those steps arrogantly, if you think you are invincible, you are going to die. No one knows how much difference prayer that night would have made in Peter's life. No one knows. It's just conjecture on our part. Would he have still fallen for the temptations? No one knows but Jesus. And it was Jesus who implored him 3 times, stay awake and pray. So Jesus apparently thought that prayer would have made a difference. Just because we're Christians, just because we've been a Christian for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, just because we come to church every Sunday, we read our Bibles and we pray, does not mean we have arrived. Our greatest battle may be this afternoon. It may be Monday. It may be Friday. It may be 2 weeks from now. We don't know when our biggest battles are going to come. We haven't arrived yet, so we must not arrogantly think we have. Look at one more thing. One thing we notice about Peter from the flight recorder is that he reacted to the situation instead of responding to Jesus. He reacted to the situation instead of responding to Jesus. Do you remember that commercial? It was a while back. That man, I believe he's sitting there and he's like reading a newspaper or whatever, and all of a sudden the headline changes on the writing. It says, "You'll have your heart attack today at 2:00 or something like that." You know, and of course it's a commercial about heart health. You know, and it goes on making the point, of course, is that we don't know when something like that's going to happen, so we have to prepare for that time. We're not going to be told exactly. You know, we don't know when. We don't know what's going to happen. So we must be prepared and ready for when it does happen. Jesus did his best to warn Simon Peter and the others what was going to happen. Now, when we look at this, Jesus, when he comes to wake his disciples up from the 3rd time, it says that they were coming to arrest him at that moment. Matthew 26, verse 51 through 53 says, with that, one of Jesus' companions reached for his sword, drew it out and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. "Put your sword away in its place," Jesus said to him, "for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels?" All this time that Simon Peter has spent with Jesus, and he's still got the attitude that, "Jesus, you can't survive without me. That I have to fight the battles for you." And Jesus in this heated moment tells them, he says, "Put the sword away." He says, "Don't you know that just a snap of a finger, just a thought from my mind, that my Father will send me 12 legions of angels?" A Roman legion was 6,000 men. And he says, I could call 12,000, or I could call 12 legions. That's 72,000 angels to be at my disposal at a moment's thought. I don't need your sword, Peter. But Peter has got that idea. Now, in the parallel account in John, now here it doesn't tell us who drew the sword, But in the parallel account over in John, it tells us who drew the sword. How many guesses you want who drew the sword? John 18:10 says this, "Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear." Now here's the point I want to make, and it may not be any more important than any of the others we've made here today. But this one stands out to me the most. Peter relied on his strength and courage and smarts and goodness and leadership abilities. And when that kind of confidence fails, and it always does, when that confidence fails, and it always does, we come crashing down because we will react to the situation and not respond to Jesus. All Peter did that night was make it harder for Jesus. And all of the confusion of the night, Jesus had to calm everybody down. He had to heal the man, and he had to stop him. They would have killed everybody in the group because of what Peter did. But Jesus diffuses the situation. Let me ask, do you react to the situation, or do you respond to Jesus? How many of your biggest regrets in life, your biggest message, your times you embarrassed yourself, your family, your church, your God, when you reacted to the situation because you were not prepared for the situation? That temptation, that answer that you gave, the time you lost your temper on the ball field, those hurtful words that you can't take back. I see it all the time as a minister. The things that not only what we do, that we lose our control and do, but the unwise decisions that are made in families and marriages because we respond to the pressure of the situation and not to how Jesus has asked us, commanded us to surrender our wills to him and just do what he wants us to do. If we're not prepared for what? If our confidence is not in Jesus, if we're not prepared for the thing that's going to crop up and happen that we had no warning was going to happen, we will react to the situation and not respond to Jesus. And I've got to say that I see more damage done out in the unsaved world by Christians because of this very thing. That we don't act like Christians at the moment we should be Christians the most. Well, we know that what happens, they take Jesus away to the mock trials. Peter and John follow at a distance. Someone recognizes Peter and says, "Hey, you're one of those men with Jesus." He says, "No, I'm not." Another one asks the same thing. Then finally the third one asks and says, "You were with him, weren't you?" And he finally calls down curses and denies he even knew the man. It says the rooster crowed. And Simon Peter went away, crushed, because he didn't even realize he was capable of doing such a thing. Now, for us, what do we do with all of this? You see, because if we don't do something with this, it's just simply a story, a historical story. What do we do with this? One, for us to follow Jesus, I think we need to recognize this, that Peter's confidence was in the wrong place. It was in himself. It wasn't in God. Are you finding yourself in that same place? That you can't surrender yourself to God because your confidence is in you and your abilities as a husband, a father, a mother, a mom, a worker, a boss, whoever it is. Paul in one place said, all the things I've accomplished in my life, and he had a pretty good degree, he said, are like garbage now. He said, all I care about is knowing Christ. That's when you surrender to him and stop having confidence in what you are and who you are. Next thing that we can take away from this is that you have strengths. You have blessings. You have strengths that God wants to use. But until you surrender them to him, you'll be blind to your weaknesses. You have strengths, but you have weaknesses as well. Same with me. But if we just see our strengths and we haven't surrendered to God, we'll never see our weaknesses. It was Martin Luther, the church reformer, who was writing in his journal. He said, busy, 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 so many things to do. He said, I have so much to do today that I must spend the first 3 hours in prayer. Now that's the opposite of the way I think. I have so much to do today, I don't have time to pray. I'll make up for it tomorrow. I've got so many places to be, I'm not going to read the Bible today. I'll make up for that later. When our confidence is in ourselves, we will miss our weaknesses and we will crash. And the final thing is this: how are you responding to the situations in life? Are you just reacting to the situations, or are you responding to Jesus? The first one's got to begin here. Have you responded to Jesus to start with? See, it's only through his power will you actually ever be able to walk with him. So what do? What does your flight data recorder tell you today? Let's pray.